Finding a story worth handing on, narrative and meaning making. By way of review, we have seen in Sandel three basic approaches to what makes for a just society: welfare, liberty, and virtue. Recall Sandel's basic criticism that basing justice on welfare and liberty flattens value. Since justice is about rightly distributing what we value, it is necessary to have an adequate understanding of value before we can decide how things of value ought to be distributed. This, in turn, led to a discussion of Aristotle's virtue theory of ethics. Rather than deriving ethics from abstract principles, virtue theory starts by seeing what makes for a good person and ties value to purpose. This theory has been criticized as being incapable of determining right action, as illustrated by Aristotle's defense of slavery and the subservient place of women. We have looked at possible remedies for this problem in the form of hybrid deontology, where a theory such as Kant's categorical imperative would serve as the basis for ethics, but virtue gives one the ability to carry out the demands of justice. The issue with this view is that while tacking virtue onto a system such as Kant's does provide virtue with a moral compass, it does not address the flattening issue that Sandel brings up. We will now turn to Wadell to amplify something that Sandel brought up briefly, namely, the idea of narrative as a way of determining what we value. In each of the theories that we have looked at so far, one common feature is that they take one idea and build an entire system on it. With utilitarianism, it is general welfare. Libertarian, it is self-ownership. With Kant, it is the categorical imperative, and Rawls, it is justice as fairness. You can even see this in some extent with Aristotle, with his understanding that the human telos is tied with being a rational animal. Starting with one grand idea involves removing the particulars and focusing on ideal objects. For instance, let us say that you are looking for a formula to describe the pattern from otherwise random activities, say the distribution of steel balls down a maze. One does not consider the individual imperfections of the steel balls or whether the spacing of the pins is precisely uniform. These differences tend to cancel each other out. One instead assumes perfect steel balls and precisely spaced pins. These are ideal objects, and this approach is sometimes called a view from nowhere. It is easy to see the attractiveness of this approach when one tries to do ethics. We don't need to deal with the messy particulars of human beings. And really, if the behavior of steel balls can be described by abstract principles, why not the ethical behavior of human beings? The issue Wadell brings up, however, is that the messy particulars of what it is to be human, if these are stripped out, is there anything really left? Ethics seems to be all about human relationships, and these appear to be constantly shifting and essential to who we are. Each of us have particular histories, but these histories are set in larger context. For instance, large-scale events that shaped my life would include the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam conflict, Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and such. These provide a trajectory of how we evaluate events. Your large-scale events would differ from mine, and so would have different trajectories. Notice, however, that the big events don't necessarily determine what you think is right or wrong, or what is of value. What we think of as right or good or valuable is shaped by how we make sense of the events, the story or narrative that we develop. That is why value resists flattening based on some abstract principle. Sandel brings up the work of Alistair MacIntyre. MacIntyre's take on virtue ethics was to cast it in terms of narrative. Think of it this way. Virtue ethics starts with the purpose of something. Purpose or function is tightly connected with meaning. If I ask what the word foot means, you can give me a range of meanings. But if I ask you what foot means in the sentence, a foot is 12 inches, you would narrow the meaning down considerably because foot has a specific function within that sentence. McIntyre's point is that meaning makers are such that we make sense of the world by the narratives or stories that we create. Values emerge out of the stories and meanings that we have created. Virtues, in turn, develop in order to pursue what we value. Narratives, however, are not of neutral value. On the slide, there are a couple of illustrations. On the left is the book cover of the 1619 Project. It tells the history of the United States as one where racism is a defining feature in the development of the nation. It is a narrative where racism not only is a driving force, but one that white people largely have never recognized, and where black people, having to have fought harder for it, understand the value of liberty. Next to it is an illustration of Project 1776. Here, the story is one of idealists fighting for individual liberty. Consequently, things such as racism, while real, are aberrations. Depending on which narrative resonates with a person determines what is just. If 1619 resonates, one might well affirm calls for reparations for racism or support DEI programs. On the other hand, if 1776 is closer to one's lived experience, then reparations and DEI would run counter to the central national ideal of individual liberty. The illustrations on the right are intended to contrast the dueling narratives of the United States as a pluralistic society versus that of a Christian nation. Depending on which narrative fits better with the one a person has constructed for themselves will alter how one reads one's history and current events. The choice between the two can give rise to seeing one side attacking the values of the other. It is therefore important that we step outside our own narratives that we have constructed because our own narratives are never complete. A criticism of meaning-making via narrative is that it is simply relativism dressed up in new clothing. The argument is that if value is just narrative, then any narrative will do, and value is simply a matter of choice. Wadell counters that we already know that some stories are better than others. That is, stories as stories are not value-free. Value only arises from stories because value is part of the nature of all things, not simply something that we impose upon them. Recall that virtue theorists deny that one cannot derive an ought from an is. What makes for a good story, then? Within Catholic social teaching, one can come up with the following. 1. It represents the dignity of every person. A feature of Christianity that it shares with Judaism and Islam is that human beings are made in the image of God. Any story that entails that some individuals are less valuable due to their sex, sexuality, race, religion, social status, or ethnic background is a distortion that will inevitably lead to an unjust society. 2. It allows for a genuine polis. Recall that for Aristotle, a society or polis is not simply a collection of people dedicated to commerce and mutual defense. In the previous slide, we saw 4 different and conflicting narratives. The one thing that the 1619 and 1776 narratives have in common, however, is that they see the United States as a society where certain values are to be instilled. Stories that do not recognize the role of the community in character formation is one that does not understand the nature of the characters in that narrative. 3. It seeks the common good. The common good are those goods that we all ought to have access to. We will be looking at this in more detail in succeeding chapters. 4. It recognizes injustice. Think about any good work of fiction. There's always some element of adversity. Any story where everything goes well not only is uninteresting, but it does not resonate with what we know to be true. If a narrative that we tell ourselves does not take injustice into account, it simply either ignores the state in which we find ourselves or doesn't know how to deal with injustice. Perhaps the central theme of Christianity is that of the resurrection of Jesus. The message here is that death and defeat are not the end of the story. Striving for justice is not in vain. The Christian response to injustice is not resignation, but to witness to the power of the resurrection in conforming ourselves and society to the ideal that we are created in the image of God. It also means that new ways of ordering society are possible. The current state of things is not as good as things can get. There is room for hope, and we should strive for that hope. It means that the narratives that we have created are not the last word. Unlike Aristotle, we do not presume to fully understand what it is to be human, and so society must continue to change as that understanding develops. With the promise of the resurrection comes the promise that history is going somewhere, that it has an arc, and that if we pay attention, that arc is good. The Christian narrative is one that involves forgiveness, repentance, and reconciliation. It is a narrative that aims at reconciliation. Reconciliation entails that there have been past injustices. We have to admit that we have not always given each person his or her own due, and sometimes our faulty ideals of justice are to blame. Such admissions are requests for forgiveness. With such request comes the call of repentance, which is not simply being sorry for the wrongs committed or even refraining from committing them again, but a sincere attempt to make things right. A society that simply stops being sexist, racist, or homophobic is not just until it corrects for the damage that it has already done. Finally, like some of the characters in Jesus' parables, compassion, Adam Smith's fellow feeling, is necessary, just as one needs to care about the characters in a story for that story to be any good. The Christian story is one where God has compassion for God's creatures. Any narrative we construct for ourselves has to count the value and virtue of compassion for one's fellow human being.